I'm Jackie Schertz. Welcome to Hey Listen. Today's topic is deaf education, a crisis in America. We've been trying to encourage deaf people to send letters to legislators, but they're not real comfortable with writing. Their native language is sign language, and this is an opportunity for us to express our feelings about the deaf education in America and send it to the New York State Governor, Cuomo, and our President, President Bush, and let them know how we feel about this issue. Deaf kids have very unique needs, communication needs that we need to fulfill so our children can grow intellectually and emotionally. So don't go away. We'll be right back and talk with our four guests. Welcome back to Hey Listen. Our issue today is deaf education, a crisis in America. We're very honored to have four guests with us here today. Alan Hurwitz. He is a parent with a daughter at RSD, Rochester School for the Deaf, and he's also president of the Parent Staff Association at RSD. Robin Horwitz, who is a senior at Rochester School for the Deaf, and also president of the Student Council at RSD. Gary Mowl, who is a parent with 3 kids at RSD, and he's a coordinator for the local Rochester rally and the effort here for the rally that will be happening in Albany. And also Sue Wilkens. She is a parent with a daughter at RSD. Thank you all for being with us today. This is a big issue with the deaf education. We need some background information. What's this, what's that, how the laws impact us. When Public Law 94-142 was passed back in 1975, many people with disabilities just thanked the government for passing this law. They thought it was a godsend to them. Is that true for deaf children as well? Maybe you can give me a little background on that.
I believe there was a lot of mixed responses to the new law when it was passed in 1975. It's important to look at the historical issues and the reasons for its establishment. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, there were several groups, parents' groups, that had many retarded children, parents of mentally retarded children, who felt very strong that their children should be taken out of the institutes and put into community-based programs and allow them to be mainstreamed into the communities. They worked with their legislatures to pass a law. During that same process, many other groups thought that was a very good idea to also happen for other disabilities. So many different disability groups jumped on the bandwagon And as time went on, the legislators decided to make one law for all handicapped children. This new law was passed and was called as Public Law 94-142. And it covered all handicapped children. As time passed, there was some confusion as to what is really best for each disabled child. The special needs of deaf children. There was a great confusion about the terminology of least restrictive environment. The present interpretation of LRE, least restrictive environment, is that it means any public school system should be a place where handicapped children would be educated with other non-handicapped children. That is the present interpretation. But there are many deaf children that it really doesn't seem to work well for. It does not allow deaf children. Many of these children grow up in an environment that is not the least restrictives that are upon them.
So what's least restrictive for other children may not be least restrictive for the deaf children.
Correct.
Robin, you are a student in the deaf school.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the least restrictive or most restrictive for you?
Well, to me, I feel that the deaf school itself is a better place for me. And I really want to make sure that the least restricted environment doesn't apply to all children, because some students that are capable of going through the mainstream program, but some of the students that are in the residential programs are more appropriate there. I met some other friends from other different areas that are capable of interacting and participating in mainstream program. Myself, it's residential.
So are you opposed to mainstreaming?
No, I don't oppose mainstream, but I oppose the idea and the definition of least restricted environment.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I would like to comment. I think that the least restrictive environment has to get rid of communication barriers, and I think that's the basic handicap involved with deafness is a communication barrier. That doesn't mean that all deaf children have equal access to education in a mainstream setting. For some children it's fine. For our daughter it's not the right placement at this time because there isn't equal access even with the use of support services.
Go ahead.
I think it's important to explain what environment means. Many people interpret least restrictive environment to mean putting a deaf child into a classroom and providing an interpreter, and that inherently solves the problem, they believe. But if you really look at this, what we need to look at is the most enabling environment. What I mean is I don't want my children to have to look at one person, that interpreter, for all their communication input, where they can receive communication access from only one person in their entire environment. I feel it's crucial for my children to be able to interact not only with a teacher, but with other children there. And if they go to the library, to have a librarian there who can sign. And to be involved in team sports or out on the playground and have coaches they can communicate with. There's no way one individual can provide a whole language approach. Children need to be exposed to a variety of people they can communicate with. For that reason, I feel a residential school for the deaf is probably the most appropriate placement and the most enabling environment.
The Canadians have been observing what we have been doing with the LRE, least restrictive environment, and they have a more positive aspect of saying a more positive viewpoint of it is most enabling environment. The deaf children have special, unique needs, and you kind of touched on that a little bit. Can you explain that a little bit more?
I'd like to say that there has been a lot of confusion about LRE. and the interpretation of least restrictive environment. In the present interpretation, it's the public school system. That a handicapped child should and must be educated with non-handicapped children. Through that definition and that present interpretation, it means that a handicapped child must be placed in an LRE first, least restrictive environment first, in the public school system, and then needed to provide support services. If that child fails and does not succeed in that environment, then we can begin to look for other options, such as residential schools. Many people support the concept of quality education for deaf children, really oppose this present definition. We feel that we should look at the child, evaluate the child's needs first, develop an individual aspect, and plan for that individual child. Then look for the least restrictive environment based upon the child's needs, regarding from the public school system to residential schools and any programs in between. And that way we can actually develop and determine the least restrictive environment. But under the present interpretation of least restrictive environment means that the Rochester School for the Deaf could be considered an LRE for many deaf children. A mainstream program, like Robin was mentioning, could be considered an LRE for other deaf children. So we're not saying that all school programs, we are saying that all school programs should be considered as a least restrictive environment, depending upon the needs of the children.
That's right on. There's a continuum, and there are different alternatives on this continuum that people should be able to choose from. And all can have a least restrictive environment. And we don't need to have a hierarchy of least restrictive environments. It needs to be a continuum and a range of least restrictive
You're
environments.
talking about a continuum of options, and we have a problem with that, because they say this far left end is the least restrictive environment, and then as you go down the road, we become restricted environments down the way. What we would like to do is oppose and create a new definition and create a circle effect and have a variety of options that we can pull from to have the child in the middle and using all resources that are available.
I like that idea of the circle. Now, with the New York State budget that the governor has proposed, what are the different issues in regards to that?
It's a difficult concept and a difficult issue. Perhaps help me out here, but
Okay, sure.
Governor Cuomo, well, what we need to do is, Governor Cuomo is looking to the school districts. Historically, each local school district has paid the state some money anytime they send deaf children to a residential school. Now, historically, that local school district would pay the state the equivalent costs of educating a child at a school right there within the home district. Now, you have to remember that the cost per child attending a residential school is approximately $35,000. That's correct, $35,000 for each student. Now, for students educated in a local school district, for example, where I live, the average cost is about $2,800, $2,900 per child. So when the school district historically was required to pay perhaps that $2,900 when the student was placed at a school like RSD, and the state would make up the difference. Now, what's being proposed in this new budget is that the local school district pay 35% of the actual cost of placing that child in the school. So that's the first issue, is the amount of money being paid. The second issue is that the school district is required to pay $35,000 when the school year starts.
Just they have to give all this money in the beginning.
Right. Yes, they do. They have to pay it all up front, and then they're reimbursed the difference at the end of the school year.
We need to take a break now, and we'll talk more about that when we come back. We're going to continue on with the deaf education, a crisis in America. Gary was just explaining before the commercial break about how the state pays for the education.
Yes, so Governor Cuomo has proposed that the local school district take on greater responsibility in paying the costs of educating the children in the residential school. But really, the school districts were caught by surprise. They had no time to plan and budget for this expense this fiscal year. For myself, I have 3 children, and I live in a small town. $35,000 times 3 kids is $105,000. There's no way my local school district in a small municipality can afford that expense. So perhaps the district would have to set up their own program and mainstream my children right there in the local town. So this means that a variety of many different school districts around New York State will feel compelled to set up programs, and we may see a proliferation of programs.
So you have there's only 3 hearing impaired kids from your school district that are hearing impaired. It looks like we're going back to the old idea of the one-room schoolhouse if the kids have to stay in their own school district. How do you feel about that?
I think there's a misunderstanding, too, about what kind of services would be provided if individual school districts set up their own programs. It's not just a matter of hiring one teacher of the deaf at a smaller salary than the $35,000 and covering the cost of educating 3 children. There are many other services provided at a residential school that may be somewhat hidden. Support services such as interpreting, note-taking in the classroom. And that has to cover, and I think we talked about this before, equal access means equal access in gym class, in swimming class, in home ec, in art. So all of those periods have to be covered. It also includes audiological services, speech training services, and all of the things that are inherently involved and incorporated in that $35,000 to send the child to a residential school. That means that it's not really, in the long run, less expensive to keep those deaf children in your own home school district.
That's very true. Now, who makes the decision about where the deaf child is placed? Who makes these decisions?
Who makes those decisions about the placement of a deaf child? The law is very clear that the responsibility for placement is a local school district's decision. For example, your municipality, you go to them, the local school board. They have a committee called the Committee on Special Education, the CSC. This committee are people from the local school district. They bring in a person who is a psychologist, an audiologist, a parent's representative, plus the parents of that deaf child. And they all get together and review the child and determine the child's needs and make a placement decision. What that really means, though, is there are many CSEs who may not know much about the education needs of a deaf child and could possibly make an erroneous decision and a wrong placement upon the deaf child's needs. Because as Sue was mentioning, a lot of school districts have a wrong concept as to what is required for a quality education of a hearing impaired child. Often it comes down to a placement of a deaf child in the local school system with an interpreter, and they believe that will be sufficient and cheaper, but it's really not true. You have to look at the child's needs. That child might require an interpreter, a tutor, a note taker, require a teacher with special certification for the teaching of the hearing impaired, a speech pathologist, and a variety of other needs. Those costs add up for a single child.
So you're just saying that the educational group that make the decision for the kid's placement, and they may not have the best information about where the deaf child should be placed and his needs. They need to, where can they find more information about placement? Where can they get information about the different alternatives?
Well, I can share my personal experience related to that. At Rochester School for the Deaf, I feel they're doing the right thing. The Committee on Special Education team that I was involved with, as they were going through the deliberation with no prior experience with deaf children, what RSD decided to do was invite 2 people from the team to visit the school there all morning. And they were able to observe my children at the school. And then when we came back to the meeting, for the CSE meeting, everything went really well. They recognized the importance of the type of services that Rochester School for the Deaf could provide. So I think that's really something we should mandate, that the Committee on Special Education team members be allowed to visit different school settings.
And also, it'd be nice for them when, after they come up and see the class and observe what's going on, they need that time to be able to talk with the students to get some feedback. And that'd be something that would be important.
You're talking about the rights of the child, and you're talking about the rights of the parents. Sometimes parents get involved and they want to give the right education to their child. But what are the parents' rights and the children's rights? Do you have any comments?
I'm not real clear exactly if the rights are written down anywhere. A lot of that depends on your individual school districts. Some of the districts are very good about listening to what the parents want for their children, and also about listening to what the children want, what their experience either in the mainstream or at the residential school has been in the past. RSD has also done a wonderful job of teaching. I think Gary brought that up. Again, that depends on the school districts, the individual school district's willingness to listen and to learn from that experience and apply that to the placement of that individual child. That happens sometimes. It doesn't happen always. It's not a guaranteed right as far as I understand.
Alan?
The law itself says nothing about the parent's right to make a placement decision. The parents have actually no right. The parents only have a right to be involved in the deliberations, but it's the local school district that makes the final decision. The law also has a built-in process for due process if the parents complain with the placement decision of the local school district. The parents then have the right to go through due process. You were asking an earlier question, where do parents get the information? That in itself is a true problem here in Rochester. Rochester, we have a wonderful network system, but I'm very concerned about other areas, rural areas here in New York State, where people have no knowledge of what is really best for the education of the hearing impaired children. We often know that when parents find out that their small child is deaf, they're truly shocked. They feel guilty about and go through a long process of denial. Some parents may overcome that quickly and go on and search for additional information on deafness. But parents go through a long process of denial, and those that go for a long time without overcoming it take much more time to get this information that they really truly need to help and assist their hearing impaired child. Often, they look to the local school districts for the information, but they have no knowledge about the special education needs of the children, and that is truly a problem. I see it happening throughout the United States.
When you say the process of denial, it's a very valuable time that's lost in the child's development. With the LRE and the misinterpretation of that and where the deaf children should be placed, and they're placed in a mainstreaming situation, and they have to fail first before they're placed in a residential school.
Under the present interpretation of LRE, that could happen.
Well, I think that the residential schools, it should be an appropriate place for a deaf child to go through first. Because once they're able to excel in certain areas, then it might be easier to move into the mainstream program so they can be mainstream more appropriately. You know, I think it's a better place to go through the residential program first.
It's very interesting. We really need to make a change gradually instead of making this radical move of putting a deaf child into an environment they're not ready for. What is the deaf community's role? How can they get involved with this issue? Do you have any ideas on that?
I'd like to go back to Robin's point. It's a wonderful point. I believe there's a real need to look at the future role of residential schools. In the past, we used to call them institutes. But now this concept of those schools, as they've changed through the years, because of Public Law 94-142, the school districts really have no knowledge how to really meet the needs of the hearing impaired child. And we've really looked at the needs of the residential schools, and they've really become a central school. They've become a center for expertise in the diagnosis and assessment and evaluation of the child's needs. They can truly find the good way to evaluate these needs, and we need to make them a center for education of deafness, and they can send people that can give advice and can truly give quality service to the parents, deaf students, and also the teachers in the public education system.
It could be a resource center for deafness. We need to take a break now, and after this message, we'll be able to have audience participation. Welcome back to our topic of deaf education and crisis in America. We've had a lot of good discussion. It's helped me to understand the issues a lot better. We just asked the question, what is the role of the deaf community in this issue? And we'd like to have some audience participation.
I'll speak first as a hearing parent of a deaf child. There is no way that I can be a good deaf adult role model for my daughter. The only support that I can have is from the adult deaf community. Most of the time, that modeling is helpful not only to me, but to my daughter in a school situation. The point that we're talking about tonight is education. That deaf role modeling doesn't happen in a mainstream situation. It's not necessary for all deaf children. Some deaf children have deaf parents, and they get that role modeling at home, or the parents have deaf friends. But that's a situation that can only happen in a residential school. And I think that the deaf community certainly, the support from the deaf community certainly enhances that.
Excellent. Thank you for that comment. Okay, what about some comments from the deaf community? Way in the back.
Okay. It's been a long time, and the deaf community has not participated with this at all. It should be that there should be more action, more things going on, whatever happens. And recently there was a big change. That was the first time that an education program for the deaf was involved. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity for deaf people to do the best that they can. And it's really wonderful for deaf children. The first time they have the power to do this and the control. And this is really great for deaf children.
Excellent.
If we have this strong feeling that we've won this one, then we'll have that feeling that we'll be able to do it. From now on, we have that tendency to think, well, let's wait and see what happens and see if they do it. So we're sort of on a roll, and we need to continue that.
When you say we win on this, what are we winning?
Well, when I say win, I find that, hey, we are able to do these things, and we're able to get what we want for our own future.
Good.
Good. Wait, we have another question from the audience.
I'm the mother of 2 deaf girls, and both of the girls go to RSD now. Now, speaking from personal experience related to mainstreaming, the education is fine, but as far as socialization and being involved in different activities and clubs is minimal. I want my children to be in those things, but the opportunities are just not there. Even though I know and I've tried, I really doubt that they'll let me or my kids be involved. I really don't see that happening to my 2 deaf girls at all, being involved with social activities. And I feel that the Deaf Institute is a perfect place for educating as well as socializing for deaf children, and that's really important. Mainstreaming, I'm just not sure.
Do we have another question?
From my experience, as far as in a mainstream school myself, I feel it really hurt my education. I just, one-on-one and socializing in a hearing school, I couldn't do that at all. And it just wasn't right for me. I believe that deaf education needs to change nationally. And it really does. And we need to follow that. And deaf schools, our children need to be in that, instead of changing it. Our children are innocent. We can't just go ahead and change it. The children are innocent.
Good. We have another question here.
I believe that all deaf people, whoever they are, all over, should be put on a list for taxpayers and welfare people. They should be put on a list.
Did you want to comment on something?
Yeah, I wanted to get back to what Kathy had mentioned out there and about the activities being involved. Just a real brief example. Last weekend, we went to the Eastern State Association for the Deaf basketball tournament where all these different residential schools send teams. the fact that these kids wouldn't be able to participate in a hearing community and hearing games and stuff. Here we get together as a weekend, in which was a great experience for everybody. We have deaf leadership camp, and where we have opportunities to get together as deaf students, and it's quite difficult for us to get information on deafness. But in a residential school, we're able to get more involved in deafness and understand it better.
Right. We have another question.
I'm a student of RSD, and I have a question about being put in a mainstream environment, because I see many opportunities for deaf people in conventions and many other places that are important for deaf people to go to. And deaf people need to feel comfortable doing these things and relating to these activities. And there's really a conflict there. All of us here are deaf, and we're minorities, and we feel that deaf people really need to feel a part of things and feel at home. That's home to us. The Institute School is important.
Great. I've seen a lot of positive comments about the residential schools. Is anyone here from the mainstream schools? Does anyone here support that?
Yes, I've been mainstreamed all my life, and I've always been against going to an institute because I had never met a deaf person before. My opinion before is that their language is not lower than the person who is mainstreamed. I was always against the institute school, but now I think about the social, the emotional issues. I was emotionally underdeveloped until I went to college. I was behind in everything, and I never grew up until I went to college. That's where I started to grow up again. So now I'm changing my ideas about the institute, and I do believe that an institute school is good for child development, emotionally, and every way. I do believe that institute school is better.
We had some more hands up.
Okay, my discussion on this issue tonight is the image of the deaf model. I noticed that growing up myself in an institute, I graduated and I was involved with many community activities. And I noticed that every school has a high number of deaf students. And we need to develop our own image, because it's a very visual, and the institute, a hearing school maybe has 1, 2, 3 deaf children, and they do not know what a deaf model even looks like. In the institute, the deaf child will get the best deaf model. Well, you know, it does depend. I do support mainstreaming, because if they have a deaf teacher there, then the mainstreaming can be okay. Then the deaf student can be involved. But you have to show hearing people that we can do things as well. We need more services for the deaf in mainstreaming environment.
I have a comment over here from Sue. Do you have some comments?
Yeah, I work in the mainstream, so I feel like I can speak a little bit to the positive aspects of mainstreaming. I think the issue here is keeping options open. It's not which environment is better. I think that there are positive and negative things about both situations. But our real issue here, if we're talking about Cuomo's proposed budget cut, if we're talking about LRE and keeping 4201 schools open, we're talking about options. BOCES here in Monroe County offers a lot of different options in mainstreaming. One is the middle school, high school core classroom, where the kids have an opportunity to be with another group of deaf children throughout the day, but mainstreamed with support services for certain academic areas that they're comfortable with. That's a viable option for some deaf children, certainly not for all. But we have to keep all of the options open, not just mainstreaming, not just residential schools, but all of the options open, I think.
Can I make a comment, please?
Right. We need to keep the options open.
I'd like to reinforce what Sue just said. I personally was mainstream myself back in the dark ages. We never heard of interpreters. We never heard of support services. And how I made it through, I'll never know. But would I want to go through it again? Never, never again. Because I did well in school courses. I worked very, very hard. But socially, I was alone. I had very few friends. I could never make it on the basketball team because of all the other hearing students did better than I did. I could never participate in those things. I could participate in the golf team, and I did okay because it's a very individual sport. That doesn't mean that I'm opposed to mainstreaming. I do support the concept of mainstreaming, only if it's done right. When I talk about mainstream program that can succeed, that's when you have a critical mass number, many deaf students in one local school district, so that they can interact with one another, support one another. Also, you have teachers who can communicate with deaf children. A deaf child has the right to understand an instructor and be understood by the instructor. Communication goes both ways, not just a teacher teaching, force-feeding this information. These support services require interpreters, tutors, sign language classes for the hearing children and for the instructors, the teachers. Everyone in the school system, the parents must be involved also. Everyone must be involved to make mainstreaming work. That's the kind of mainstreaming system I support, but I haven't seen it yet. You know, possibly a living example of maybe one or two, but it's very costly. That's the kind of mainstream that would work, and I wouldn't mind going through that type myself. But going through as an only deaf child in a school district, having no communication, being able to not participate in anything, that's not interesting to me at all.
We'll continue this wonderful discussion after this message. Let's take a break. We've had a lot of excellent ideas and conversation here today and a lot of debates. We'd like to have some more audience participation.
RSD is trying to experiment mainstreaming deaf children, but I don't think it's really going to ever work. It just can't work.
Do you mean even with good support services, with interpreters, note takers, and so forth, you still don't think it's going to be ideal, perfect?
It's really a good point. I've been working at RIT for almost 20 years, Rochester Institute of Technology. And I've seen what is good is that deaf people have the choice there. Deaf people can choose to associate with hearing people. They can choose to work with deaf people. They can have associations and friends and a social life in both areas. But there, the deaf person, individual, makes the decision. If they prefer hanging around with deaf people, it's up to them. But we do not force them to associate with hearing people. It's their choice.
Okay. We have someone in the back.
I would like to... I have a deaf daughter, and really, my parents are hearing, and I really respect. They put me in a residential school, and I feel really good about that. Many activities, and then I had many friends there. I wasn't left alone. If I was in a hearing school, I would be overpowered and left out. I wouldn't be able to speak with anybody, so I feel very strong about this, to keep a child in the residential school.
What do you mean by this? By the self-esteem? Wow, that's a very important issue for a child's development. We have a lot of hands up.
I like to speak about mainstreaming and residential school and compare them. Mainstreaming, I do have some positive feeling about that. When you mainstream, it's not equal. A deaf child feels left out in a mainstreamed environment. They need help all the time. They really do. And their social skills and their personality and other very important skills are just lost. And in order for them to catch up, they really have to do a lot of work to catch up. And I just don't see this kind of catch-up happening in a mainstream environment. When you mainstream, you have to understand that if there is a deaf teacher there that is deaf, that teacher, you need also not only a deaf teacher, but a deaf audiologist and many other professionals. And you need the deaf culture in there so that the deaf person will understand about education. For example, Spanish education. They need to learn the difference in American culture and all different kinds of things. So you really need to be sensitive to that. Also, when you mainstream, for children who have more hearing, for example, some are very profoundly deaf and are mainstreamed. I think it really depends on the individual child. And for myself, I am concerned with the professionals in the school. Is everybody a professional? What about the deaf culture? Is the deaf awareness there? I really have a concern about that, a very serious concern.
I'd like to respond to the issues you're raising. Mainstreaming might work for children who have perhaps some residual hearing. I might be a good example of that. I do have some residual hearing. And I went to the public schools as I was growing up. I am the product of mainstreaming. My parents are deaf, and they provided me with a lot of support. My children also have some residual hearing. But I'd be afraid to see my children trying to function in a group that's just full of hearing students. I think they'd be the last always to respond. They'd be left out, and they'd always be last. I can remember what that's like. And I've got an assumption that some of that isn't really good. I mean, I wasn't able to make it. I was forced to drop out of that environment.
Well, the things that you were talking to about people responding to that, you develop that confidence in your own personal growth. When things continue in the same manner, you start to take that opportunity to catch up. Like at the youth leadership camp, where there's a lot of deaf kids, where these deaf kids didn't have personal growth. Where you have a president and vice president and secretary and treasurer, you have all these different offices run by different kids, and you don't see the ones that are involved from the mainstream programs, because during those first 3 weeks they start to develop their own personal growth so they can become leaders in deaf schools. But the residential kids that are there, they have that opportunity to develop their skills and do effective things, and eventually they could maybe transfer over to a mainstream program.
I'll get to the audience here in a few seconds. There are several people going to a rally in Albany. What's the purpose of that? What are you trying to accomplish at this rally?
Okay, you're probably familiar with the 4201 schools.
4201, I'm not sure what that is.
The 4201 schools is a category of 11 special schools that are funded by the state of New York. We have one state school for the deaf in Rome, one state school for the blind in Batavia, one state school for another special education group in New York, plus 8 private, semi-private schools for the deaf, like Rochester School for the Deaf, St. Mary's School for the Deaf in Buffalo. Altogether, there's 11 schools under the 4201 school category, and that's funded by New York State.
Okay, no, go ahead.
Thank you, Alan. Well, those 4201 schools and the Empire State Association of the Deaf, ESAD, are working together. And we'll be going to Albany on March 14th to have a rally. And what we're going to propose is an entire day of meetings with our legislators. And we hope to make them more aware of our concerns about Governor Cuomo's proposal that I mentioned earlier. And it seems we've had a really good response from people. Here in Rochester, we already have 3 busfuls of people who are committed to going. There's a bus of people from RSD, one from NTID, the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, and one of community people. We expect there'll be some other buses of people traveling to Albany from Buffalo and also from New York City. And what we hope to preserve is our alternatives, our right to choice.
So the result of this rally is to give people a choice for their deaf children. So that's what you're trying to succeed and accomplish.
In my perspective, yes.
Okay. Who hasn't made a comment yet?
I was thinking about is a famous quote by Thomas Jefferson that all men are created equal. The past history, blacks, if you use, everybody has rights. Women have rights. Now deaf people also have rights. But somehow that is taken away in an institutional school. It makes us less equal because we have less choices. I don't think anyone, not my parents or the United States government, nobody has a right to take away a choice that is given to us or to a normal child.
Okay, Sue?
I would just like to say that I think the focus here, again, has to be, when we go to Albany, the approach for our legislators is that Rochester School for the Deaf is not going to close. That's not the issue. There's a lot of support for residential schools in New York State. The school is not going to close, but I think we really need to focus on what's going to happen to the quality of education if the budget is cut that severely. Right now we're in the process of a great deal of encouragement about hiring and training more deaf adult teachers. That won't happen in the mainstream, but there's a possibility of that happening in the residential schools. What about teaching English as a second language and teaching core classroom curriculum in ASL? That's not going to happen in the mainstream, but it will happen in residential schools if the budget provides for that. Right now, the quality of education in deaf schools is going to go down very quickly if the budget is cut as proposed. And I think that has to be our focus in Albany.
Beautiful. We have some more questions from the audience.
Suppose when you're in a deaf institute, if the school closes, the parents of the deaf children, where will they go? In a hearing school, it's a different situation. But if in a deaf school, they can collect money or welfare. But there can be a long list. A lot of money is spent on them. That needs to be thought about.
Right, that's exactly right.
I'd like to reinforce this recent statement. I was just talking with the superintendent for the Rochester School for the Deaf, and he is saying that more and more, that a larger number of public school students are beginning to become concerned because now they're starting to realize the meaning of the local districts and saying that most of the local districts right now have no funding. They have many other problems of the local school problems. The buildings are out of date, needing to make renovations, the asbestos problems, and the many other problems, the teacher salary budgets. And they can't afford the present local problems now at this time. The higher cost of education for a deaf child is now going to find out that the superintendents of the public schools are now going to have to support these concerns, and it's a real great concern.
We have time for one more very brief question.
I would like to say that I have many hearing friends, and it's really tough for deaf people in a mainstreamed environment. It's a very limited situation there. If you go into a hearing school, that's what I mean. In a mainstream environment, it's very limited.
Good. We need to wrap it up in this discussion. And the point of this is the quality of education and choice. That is the key for deaf education. Thank you very much. Deaf education, a crisis in America. That's very true. We've learned a lot today. I want to thank the people here with us today on our panel, Alan, Robin, Gary, and Sue. And thank you for your participation. And Ray Kinney also. Thank you very much.